Last week, the Japanese had commenced their most important operation, the capture of the Dutch East Indies and the important resources that it harboured. Yet this week, they would also start a new operation for the invasion of the island of New Britain, further trying to interrupt the lines of communication between Australia and the US. As the invaders continue their advance across Borneo and the Celebes, a major breakthrough is achieved at Malaya and the Philippines. Join us as we delve into this critical point of the Pacific War. While there's plenty to say about the fighting on the front lines, there are stories from back home to be told too. And that's where the sponsor of this video, Magellan TV, the documentary streaming service founded by filmmakers, has something special. Their two-part documentary, Silent Sacrifice, Stories of Japanese-American Incarceration. See the untold stories of the 120,000 Japanese Americans whose country turned against them with the coming of war, and how their lives were altered long after the eventual peace was signed. And while you're there, you'll find the richest and most varied history content available anywhere, covering everything from the ancient to modern eras, wars, biographies, and the Earth itself. And that's just the history stuff. They also give you extensive collections of science, true crime, travel, and other documentaries. You'll never run out of stuff to watch with all this. Plus, they add 15 or more hours of 4K high-definition content every week for their subscribers at no extra cost. It's all viewable anytime, anywhere on televisions, laptops, mobile devices, and more. Get access to 3,500 hours of ad-free documentaries for only $4.99 a month, and get a month for free by subscribing to Magellan TV via our link in the description. Since the start of the war, Tokyo had acknowledged that the British presence in the island of New Britain was a huge threat to one of their most important naval bases in the Pacific, the Truk Atoll. In response, they planned Operation R, an invasion of Rabaul in New Britain and Kavieng in New Ireland. The South Seas Detachment of General Horii was earmarked to carry out Operation R after the occupation of Guam, supported by the main strength of Admiral Inouye's 4th Fleet. Due to the rapid progress across all theatres of the Pacific, back on January 4th, the Japanese had started to bombard Rabaul, the old capital of the Australian-controlled territory of New Guinea, in preparation for a naval invasion. 10 days later, the South Seas Detachment departed Truk, escorted by the 4th Fleet's main units. In Rabaul, the Australians had a garrison of around 1,400 soldiers, mainly from the 23rd Brigade, under the command of Colonel John Scanlon, while an independent company of 130 soldiers was also sent to Kavieng for the protection of the island of New Ireland. On January 20th, the 4th Fleet, including carriers Akagi and Kaga, sent over 100 aircraft, which attacked Rabaul in multiple waves. 8 Wirraways attacked, with 3 being shot down, 2 crash landing, and another damaged. The following day, an Australian Catalina flying boat discovered the invasion fleet just off Kavieng and sent a warning to headquarters before being shot down. In response, Australian soldiers quickly took up positions and their aircraft were hastily evacuated to Lae. But before continuing with the invasion of Rabaul, we turn to Burma, where the first major Japanese operations were also taking place. At the start of the war, the 143rd Regiment of the 55th Division accomplished the first attacks against British Burma during the invasion of Thailand. Upon reaching the Kra River, which marked the Thai border, the Japanese soldiers had quickly occupied Victoria Point on December 14th of 1941. The British forces at Burma, under Lieutenant General Thomas Hutton, then tried to delay the Japanese by blowing up bridges connected to Thailand, but they could not stop the Japanese from launching probing raids on southern Tenasserim. At the same time, Commander-in-Chief in India, Sir Archibald Wavell, was negotiating with Chinese leader Chiang Kai-shek to aid them with the defense of the Burma Road, the last Chinese lifeline, as the British only counted with the 46th and 16th Indian Brigades and the 1st Burma Division for the defense of their Burmese colony. In early January, Hutton had placed the 2nd Burma Brigade and the 46th Indian Brigade at Tenasserim itself, with their headquarters at the city of Mulmine. The British plan consisted of keeping the Japanese forces as far away as possible from the port of Rangoon, through which most aid flowed towards the Burma Road and China. In turn, Brigadier John Smythe thought that Tenasserim was practically indefensible, and they should retreat behind the Sitang River to establish more solid defensive positions, something that Hutton strongly opposed. This was to be a mistake, as on December 22nd, the 55th Division of Lieutenant General Ida Shojiro had assembled at Bangkok to prepare the invasion of Tenasserim. They would commence their advance on Mulmain on January 20th of 1942, heading from Raheng towards the Kokarike Pass. By January 18th, the 143rd Regiment would also manage to overcome the steep, jungle-covered Tenasserim range, then attacking Tavoy and overwhelming the 6th and 3rd Burma Rifles. The Japanese soldiers would next continue their advance on Megui, where the 2nd Burma Rifles were promptly evacuated before engaging the enemy. The occupation of Megui also saw some Burmese nationalists proclaim the creation of the Burma Independence Army, which would go on to accompany Japanese forces in this campaign. On January 22nd, the first clashes occurred at Kokarike between the 16th Indian Brigade of the 17th Indian Division and forward units of the 55th Division. The Indian defenders managed to hold on to this position with great tenacity, but they would be eventually outflanked and forced to retreat after 2 days of resistance. Between January 23rd and 29th, the Japanese would make a determined effort to establish air superiority over Tenasserim and Rangoon, and on the night of January 30th, their main attack on Mulmine would begin as Japanese forces engaged the remainder of the 2nd Burma Brigade to the south and east of the city. The invaders quickly managed to force a position on the left of a ridge and then continued to increase their pressure over the defenders throughout the next day. This position was almost impossible to defend, and the brigade was getting squeezed until Smythe finally ordered the retreat at the end of January 31st. The way to Rangoon was now open, but will have to wait some time to cover the main attack on Burma. Meanwhile in Malaya, the situation was critical for the British defenders. On the coast, the Japanese had taken the town of Moa, annihilating the 45th Indian Brigade and opening a hole in West Force's defences, while to the north, the Australians had been pushed out of Gemas after losing much equipment. On January 17th, the retreating Allied units that managed to escape from Moa regrouped at Bakri and established a defensive perimeter around it. General Percival ordered them to recapture Moa, but the remaining Indian soldiers fell into a Japanese ambush, suffering heavy casualties, and then decided to call off the counterattack. The next day, General Nishimura of the Imperial Guards Division started a three-pronged assault against the Allied positions, thus commencing the siege of Bakri. Yet the spearhead of the attack, composed of Type 95 Hago tanks, advanced without infantry support and were wiped out by Australian gunners. Despite their valiant resistance, employing an excellent tactic of moving one section at a time to enfilade the enemy positions, by January 19th, Bakri had been surrounded by the Japanese invaders, who then started a concentrated shelling of the area. At the same time, the 5th Division had been applying heavy pressure to Australian forces to the north, forcing them to retreat to Segamat by January 20th. Seeing the rapid progress of the Japanese on the coast, they would continue to retreat towards the town of Kluang, which they would reach on January 24th. In the meantime, a single Indian company was holding off an entire Japanese division, while the rest of the Allied forces started to retreat towards Parit Silong on January 20th. Isolated, this company was cut off from the Allied retreat, getting almost completely annihilated by the enemy forces. Yet West Force's retreat was also cut off by the Japanese, who managed to establish roadblocks 2 kilometers or so from Bakri. Several failed assaults were executed to break through, until a bayonet charge, led by Lieutenant Colonel Charles Anderson, managed to break through the Japanese roadblock. Under heavy Japanese pressure, Anderson would then go on to lead the Allied forces on their withdrawal to Parit Silong. They arrived at the Palit Silong Bridge on January 22nd, but the bridge was already in Japanese hands, so Anderson would have to fight his way through it. Heroically, the Allied forces resisted tank attacks at their rear while launching continuous assaults against the bridge. Yet Anderson's efforts would be unsuccessful, and so he would decide to retreat northeast towards Yongping by January 23rd, leaving behind substantial amounts of equipment and all their wounded men. These wounded men would be subjected to the same Japanese retaliations that the latter had shown elsewhere during the war. After being harshly mistreated, the 150 wounded men would be subsequently executed during the Parit Silong massacre. This was to be the end of the Battle of Muar, and afterwards, Westforce would establish positions on a line that extended from Mersing on the east coast, through Kluang, and then to Batu Pahat on the west coast, while preparing for a final retreat towards Singapore. Now we turn to the Dutch East Indies, where the 16th Army and the 3rd Fleet were preparing to resume their offensives in Borneo and the Celebes. After conducting mopping-up operations in Tarakan and Manado, the Japanese forces prepared to launch simultaneous attacks on Balikpapan and Kendari by the end of this week. Reinforced by units from Jolo, the Sakaguchi detachment departed Tarakan on January 21st, supported by Admiral Nishimura's fleet. Their plan was to have a battalion-sized unit secretly ascend the Wain River in front of the city of Balikpapan to advance deep into the rear of the city so that it could take control of its weak points in a swift surprise attack. Meanwhile, the Dutch garrison of Balikpapan numbered some 1,100 men, mainly from the 6th Battalion, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Cornelis van den Hogenband. On January 18th, alerted of an incoming Japanese attack, the Dutch commander ordered the destruction of all oil installations in Balikpapan, trying to prevent their full employment by the enemy. On January 22nd, the Japanese invasion fleet was sighted by an American PBY, so the Dutch sent some Martin B-10 bombers and 12 F-2A Brewster Buffaloes to escort to attack the convoy, as well as some of their submarines. Despite sinking the Nanamaru transport ship and damaging others while losing a single B-10, they could not prevent the landings of the Sakaguchi detachment by the early hours of January 24th. Without meeting any resistance, the main force of the Sakaguchi detachment quickly seized the Dutch airfield and then continued on towards Balikpapan. At the same time, an American task force sent by Admiral Hart was approaching the vicinity of the Dutch city. This task force, consisting of 4 destroyers, under the command of Rear Admiral William Glassford and Commander Paul Talbot, launched a strong attack against 12 Japanese transport ships, sinking 4 transports and damaging many more vessels. In return, 2 of the American destroyers only suffered light damage before retreating back to the sea. In the meantime, the surprise unit got to the mouth of the Wain River by early morning, beginning their ascent up the river. On the morning of January 25th, these soldiers got to the rear of the city, while the main force of the detachment reached the northern outskirts of Balikpapan. The Dutch garrison had been taken completely by surprise, and by midday, the surprise unit advanced into Batu Ampar and defeated Hergenband's forces in battle. They would then join with the rest of the detachment to enter into the city of Balikpapan and capture the whole urban area. Mopping up operations began the next day, aimed against the town of Samarinda, while a battalion-sized detachment under Lieutenant Colonel Kume Motozo was created to seize the oil fields at Sanga Sanga. Simultaneous to the Battle of Balikpapan, Admiral Takagi's forces had left Bangka on January 21st, launching their attack on Kendari 3 days later. With the landings of the Sasebo force by early morning, the small Dutch garrison of 400 soldiers was caught off guard and had to retreat to Mandongan after destroying as much of the Kendari II airfield as possible. Kendari and its airfield then fell by midday, while the Dutch forces retreated further back to Tawanga on the Konaweha River, from where they would start to execute guerrilla warfare. Due to intense rain making visibility poor, The next morning, a happy accident happened for the Allies, as the destroyer Hatsuharu collided with the cruiser Nagara. The collision left them both with severe damage, so they had to sail back to Davao for repairs. Yet by January 25th, with the fall of Balikpapan and Kendari, the Japanese had achieved their next step in their plan of invasion for the Dutch East Indies, getting slowly but surely ever closer to the island of Java. But in the Philippines, the Americans had much bigger things to worry about. With the Abukay Line pierced and the 51st Division destroyed, General MacArthur had sent his last reserves to stop the Japanese advance before it was too late. In turn, General Nara of the 65th Independent Mixed Brigade decided to slice through the Abukay Line along the Abo-Abo River Valley, and although the Philippine scouts offered much resistance, they could hardly stop the advance of the Japanese 9th Regiment. Eventually, however, General Parker's efforts managed to pay off, as the American forces began to hold off their enemy in a series of attacks and counterattacks that lacked decisive action. Meanwhile, General Homma demanded more progress on the western sector, so he reinforced the 122nd Regiment there with the main force of the 16th Division, under the command of Major General Kimura Naoki. With Kimura now in charge of the western offensive, the Japanese forces started to push the 1st Division out of the Mauban Line by January 18th, while the main strength of the 16th Division broke through the apparently not impassable Mount Natib area and started to drive southwest of the Salanganan Ridge, with the objective of cutting off the Filipino defenders. By January 21st, the Mauban Line had been completely pierced, with Japanese soldiers enveloping the 1st Division and pushing towards the coast. Under more pressure, General Wainwright finally ordered the abandonment of the Mauban Line and a general retreat southwards. The following day, Nara started a massive assault against the Abukay Line after a heavy bombardment of the American positions, forcing the defenders to slowly commence to retreat. In the end, the deteriorating situation at the Mauban Line also forced MacArthur to pull all remaining units from the Abukay Line. On January 23rd, the gradual retreat towards the new Bagak-Orion Line thus commenced, being successfully completed by January 26th. Now we finally get back to New Ireland, where around 400 SNLF Marines landed on the morning of January 22nd, quickly taking the main town of Kavieng and engaging the small force of Australian commandos. After a fierce struggle, the defenders would have to withdraw towards the Souk River, where they would start guerrilla warfare operations. The following day, the bulk of the South Seas detachment landed at several points on the beaches of the Rabaul area, capturing many batteries and some minor airfields. In response, Colonel Scanlon ordered the destruction of military facilities and a general withdrawal from the town of Rabaul. Yet the Australian units had already been engaged by General Hori's forces, so the defenders would split into small groups that managed to retreat through the jungles by January 24th, then starting to execute guerrilla warfare. By this point, the Japanese had occupied Rabaul and were preparing to begin mopping up operations up to Lassell Bay. The Japanese would also execute mopping up operations in New Ireland until January 24th, then sweeping through Namatanai and its neighbouring islands for 4 days straight. Luckily for the Japanese, the military facilities and airfields at Rabaul were quickly repaired, with Rabaul becoming the biggest Japanese base in the New Guinea region. The success of this operation, as well as the victories at Batan, Muar, Balikpapan, Kendari and Tenasserim, continued the triumphant trend that the Japanese had been enjoying. Yet this was only the beginning, as next week the Japanese would continue their advance across the Philippines, Malaya and the Dutch East Indies, getting ever nearer to the final objectives of their respective campaigns. We will continue releasing weekly episodes on the Pacific War, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see it. Please consider liking, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Our videos would be impossible without our kind patrons and YouTube channel members, whose ranks you can join via the links in the description to know our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.